When an empath becomes emotionally unavailable, people often misinterpret what they are witnessing. They assume it is bitterness. They assume it is punishment. They assume it is a defensive reaction that will soften with time. But emotional unavailability in an empath is not a reaction. It is a resolution. And once it appears, it does not negotiate its way back into openness. Most people associate emotional unavailability with avoidance, fear of intimacy, or unresolved trauma. But Carl Jung warned that not all withdrawal comes from fear. Some withdrawal comes from awareness. The empath does not close off because they are incapable of connection. They close off because they finally understand the cost of staying open without protection. For a long time, the empath's emotional availability was mistaken for resilience. They were always reachable, always willing to listen, always prepared to hold space for others. They responded quickly. They forgave easily. They stayed present even when their own needs were ignored. Over time, this availability became an expectation rather than a gift. And that is where the imbalance began. Jung believed that the psyche cannot tolerate prolonged imbalance without consequence. When one aspect of the personality is overused, another part begins to emerge to restore equilibrium. In empaths, excessive openness eventually calls forth its opposite, detachment. This detachment does not arrive suddenly as a mood, it arrives as a boundary. When an empath becomes emotionally unavailable, it is rarely because of a single betrayal or argument. It is the accumulation of small moments that went unnoticed, conversations where they spoke but were not heard, apologies that changed nothing, promises that dissolved with time. Each moment taught the psyche the same lesson: being emotionally available did not create safety. Jung observed that when the unconscious reaches a conclusion, it communicates it decisively. This is why the empath's withdrawal often feels sudden to others. One day they are still engaging, still trying, still caring. The next day, something is different. Their responses are shorter. Their energy is quieter. Their emotional presence is no longer freely offered. This is not emotional numbness. Numbness is the absence of feeling. What the empath experiences is precision. They feel exactly what is theirs to feel and nothing more. They stop absorbing emotional chaos that does not belong to them. They stop internalizing responsibility for outcomes they cannot control. Emotional unavailability becomes a filter, not a wall. Carl Jung spoke often about individuation, the process by which a person becomes psychologically whole. A key part of this process is learning to differentiate between what belongs to the self and what belongs to others. Empaths struggle with this distinction for much of their lives. Their sensitivity makes them porous. Emotional unavailability is the moment they become defined. This shift is deeply unsettling for people who are accustomed to unlimited access. They notice that the empath no longer reacts the same way. Emotional appeals lose their effect. Guilt no longer lands. Drama fails to provoke urgency. The empath is still present, but not emotionally invested in maintaining the old dynamic. People often describe this as being shut out, but Jung would describe it as emotional sovereignty. The empath has reclaimed authority over their inner world. They decide what enters. They decide what stays. They decide what drains them and what nourishes them. This choice is quiet, but it is absolute. What makes this change permanent is not anger, but clarity. The empath is no longer confused about what is happening. They no longer search for alternative explanations that excuse harmful behavior. They no longer translate neglect into misunderstanding. The story they tell themselves has changed, and with it, their emotional availability. Jung warned that clarity dissolves attachment more effectively than pain. Pain can still be rationalized. Clarity cannot. Once the empath understands that their openness was being used rather than respected, emotional availability loses its meaning. It no longer feels like love. It feels like self-erasure. This is why attempts to reconnect often fail. Others may promise to change, to do better, to finally listen. But the empath is no longer responding to promises. They are responding to patterns, and patterns, once seen clearly, lose their persuasive power. Emotional unavailability in an empath does not mean they are incapable of intimacy. It means intimacy must now meet conditions: reciprocity, consistency, respect. Without these, access is denied, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Jung emphasized that the psyche learns through experience, not intention. No matter how good someone's intentions sound, the empath's unconscious has already learned what openness leads to in that particular dynamic. Emotional unavailability becomes the psyche's way of saying, "This path no longer serves me." This transformation also changes how the empath experiences conflict. Previously, conflict felt overwhelming because it threatened connection. Now conflict feels informative. It reveals whether the other person is capable of meeting the empath in mutual reality. If not, withdrawal happens naturally. There is no internal struggle about staying or leaving. This is the moment many people mistake for coldness. But coldness implies a lack of feeling. What the empath experiences is selectivity. They no longer pour emotional energy into places where it evaporates. They conserve it, they protect it, they invest it where it can grow. Jung believed that psychological maturity involves the ability to tolerate being misunderstood. The empath reaches this stage when emotional unavailability no longer feels like loss. They accept that some people only valued them for their availability, not their presence, and that realization no longer hurts, it simply informs. One of the most profound changes occurs in how the empath relates to silence. Silence used to feel dangerous, like abandonment or rejection. Now it feels neutral, even comforting. Silence no longer needs to be filled with explanations or reassurance. It becomes a space where the empath remains intact. This is also when the empath stops chasing closure. They no longer need final conversations or mutual understanding. Jung noted that closure is often a substitute for self-trust. Once the empath trusts their own perception, closure becomes unnecessary. They already know what they need to know. Emotionally unavailable empaths do not disappear dramatically. They fade from dynamics that require constant emotional labor. They reduce contact. They simplify communication. They stop volunteering personal information. The withdrawal is gradual in behavior, but complete in intention. People who are psychologically healthy adjust to this new boundary. They respect it. They meet the empath where they are. Relationships that were built on mutual respect often survive and even improve. Relationships built on imbalance do not. Jung warned that boundaries expose truth. When an empath becomes emotionally unavailable, they reveal who valued them as a person and who valued them as a resource. The empath does not need to accuse or confront. The reactions speak for themselves. What remains after this transformation is a different kind of presence. Quieter, more grounded, less reactive. The empath is no longer scanning for emotional cues or anticipating other people's needs. They are present in their own body, their own thoughts, their own rhythm. This presence feels different to others. There is less urgency, less emotional intensity, but more stability. Conversations become clearer, expectations become realistic. The empath no longer overpromises or overextends. They do not rescue, they do not chase, they simply show up as they are. Carl Jung believed that this state marks a return to the self. The empath is no longer defined by how much they give, but by how well they live in alignment with their inner truth. Emotional unavailability is not a closing of the heart. It is the heart learning discernment. This is why the empath does not revert to their old self. Once emotional availability is withdrawn consciously, it cannot be offered unconsciously again. The psyche has learned its limit. And limits, once respected internally, do not collapse under external pressure. The most
पहली बार अच्छे
unsettling
लग रहे हैं
aspect
इससे
for
मसाज
others
होती है
is that the empath does not appear wounded. They appear calm. There is no need to prove strength or independence. The empath is no longer performing resilience. They are simply living it. Jung warned that people often fear emotional unavailability because it mirrors their own dependence. When someone no longer needs emotional reassurance, emotional control loses its power. The
तो कभी
empath's
कभी तो मिलती
detachment
हैं ऐसी
becomes a
चीजें
mirror
अलग
that reflects imbalance
बनाई हुई
back to the
देखने
other
की
person. This is not cruelty, it is clarity in action. The empath is no longer available for dynamics that require them to shrink, explain, or endure. They are available for relationships that honor mutual presence. And once this shift occurs, it becomes the new baseline. Emotional availability is no longer automatic, it is intentional, it is earned, it is protected. That is what happens when an empath becomes emotionally unavailable. Not disappearance, not bitterness, but the quiet arrival of self-respect. And according to Carl Jung, that is not the end of empathy. It is the beginning of wholeness.